Welcome to Light Over Heat with Professor David Yamane. You are watching part of a 7-part series of a public webinar that I gave this past spring on 10 essential observations on guns in America. I hope that you find some value in this work. Everything that I do, I try to provide free with no paywall so that it's free to you. But honestly, this work is not free to me. So if you would like to help support my work, minimally, if you could like and share this work in your own social network so that more people have an opportunity to learn about what I'm doing and the education that I'm trying to give can spread beyond my own built-in social networks. If you would like to financially support the work I do and all of the infrastructure and time that it takes, in the show notes you'll see some options for doing that, notably making contributions through my Buy Me a Coffee platform, which is an alternative to Patreon that you may be more familiar with. So I do appreciate your support. I do hope you find some value in this work, and I do hope that you'll support me in one of these ways that makes sense to you. Okay, so Module 3. We're going to continue with Wright's fourth observation. I'm going on this one half of one observation quite a while because this is the heart of, what I do. So, the first observation being half the households in the country own at least one gun, 200 million already in circulation, give or take a few tens of millions. We've kind of updated those observations empirically. I'm not clicking through here again. I don't know why. Most of those 200 million guns, Wright said, are owned for socially innocuous sport and recreational purposes, and many guns are also owned for self-defense against crime. I think we've updated that, especially observation 3, under this concept of gun culture 2.0. So most people, many people still use their firearms for recreational purposes, but the predominant reason for gun ownership today is defensive, or what I call gun culture 2.0. So for today, again, continuing to dwell on this observation that many guns are owned for self-defense against crime. And here really, looking not just at defense generally, but self-defense specifically in terms of concealed carry or, carrying your firearms outside the home for purposes of self-defense against crime. Now, I begin my Concealed Carry Revolution mini book by reflecting on this sort of myth of the Wild West in popular imagination, constructed, through pulp novels and then also through Hollywood movies and TV shows, the gunfight at Dodge City and the more famous gunfight at the OK Corral, creating a sense in our minds that, people were just carrying guns around and shooting at each other willy-nilly in the Wild West. And in fact, I observe that it's far easier for a private citizen to carry a concealed firearm today in Dodge City, Kansas, or in Tombstone, Arizona, than it was in the 19th century. And this very famous photo you see on the left-hand side on the main street going into Dodge City, clearly said the carrying of firearms strictly prohibited. Sandy and I went to Dodge City and checked out the museum there, the Tombstone Museum, and sorry, not the Tombstone Museum, the Dodge City Museum, and they have a replica of that sign there that, of course, I had to have a picture taken with. Also, the city of Tombstone, clearly declared unlawful for any person to carry deadly weapons, concealed or otherwise, within the limits of the city of Tombstone. So again, this, myth of the Wild West as compared to the reality, and today, much easier to carry concealed weapons in public in most places of the United States, including the quote-unquote Wild West. So, this gives us the periodization of concealed carry laws. Again, a rough periodization, as all of my periodizations are rough, but a useful heuristic, I hope. So pre-1813, there were restrictions on carrying concealed weapons, and there was never not some consideration of the who, what, where, when, and how, going back to the Statute of Northampton in 1300s in England. But to my knowledge, there were no statewide bans on carrying concealed weapons. But then from 1813 to 1839, this restricted era of gun carry begins as states start to ban the carrying of concealed weapons. That consolidates from 1850s into the 1980s, which then ushered in this new era of from 1980s into the 2000s of gun law liberalization, the rise of what we can call the shall issue era, or what I call the concealed carry revolution. And then certainly we realize that today we're in the era of permitless carry, with the shall issue revolution having been completed. The next phase of that concealed carry revolution is permitless carry. So that's the broad periodization. I don't want to assume that people know what the gun carry laws are, what these terms mean, but the movement, we would say, that arrow following from sort of no issue to may issue to shall issue to unrestricted or permitless carry. So no issue means concealed carry weapons were entirely banned, although it's interesting to know that in many places that banned concealed carry allowed for open carry. This idea that people who carried their weapons concealed were sort of shady and criminal, and an honest and upstanding man would carry their weapon openly. So this applies to North Carolina, for example, which banned concealed carry for a long time, but has never banned open carry. All right, may issue, the may and may issue has to do with the state authority having discretion to determine whether an applicant has sufficient cause or need to carry and or is of good moral character, right? So the state has discretion to decide that. And in many places where there had been may issue, it was de facto no issue, right? So I think of Hawaii or San Francisco, which were may issue. The authorities could have issued permits if they wanted to, they just didn't want to. So may issue in that sense was no issue. Shall issue, if the applicant meets all of the statutory requirements, then the authority shall or really must issue the permit to carry, which doesn't mean that every shall issue state is created equally, because the requirements that need to be met under the statute can vary considerably from state to state. And then, unrestricted or permitless carry, some people call this Alaska carry or constitutional carry or Vermont carry. No permit is required to carry a concealed weapon in public. Of course, you still need to be able to legally possess a firearm, right? Also oftentimes restricted to in-state residents. But this is the basic pattern that we've gone, again, from 1813, when states started to ban carrying of concealed weapons, to the may issue era, to the shall issue era, and now really in the permitless carry era. So, why did the restricted era of concealed carry begin in the early 1800s? Because of things that were happening with concealed weapons in society at the time. So I like this quote from a Montgomery, Alabama lawyer to the French Observer of American Society, Alexis de Tocqueville. He writes that there is no one here but carries arms under his clothes. At the slightest quarrel, knife or pistol comes to hand. These things happen continually. It is a semi-barbarous state of society, right? So in response to this felt sort of social problem of crime being committed with concealed weapons, you see Kentucky and Louisiana banning concealed carry very early on, followed by Indiana, Georgia, Arkansas, Tennessee, Virginia, and Alabama, which are notable because these are all what we would think of as being southern states, right? So we think maybe today of the Northeast or the northern states being more restrictive toward guns, but this restricted era of concealed carry really begins in the South. Of course, there was also a northern model for regulating concealed carries, as scholars call this the Massachusetts model, formalized in 1836 towards the tail end of that first wave of southern concealed carry bans, limited public weapon carry to those who had a reasonable cause to fear an assault or other injury or violence to his person or to his family or property, right? So this language is very much like the good cause language that we see in May issue states. Was adopted, by Maine, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, Minnesota, Oregon, Virginia, and where people were allowed to carry, right, there was the possibility that another person could claim they had a reasonable cause to fear an injury or breach of the peace from the carrier, and the accused would then have to prove their good cause for carrying the weapons. And if a justice of the peace found that the person didn't have good cause to carry the weapon, they'd have to provide what were called a surety, or essentially a bond for keeping the peace, and that if the accused further violated the public carry law, then the accused could be jailed or fined or both. And so, this was an effective sort of northern model of really making it very difficult for people to get to legally carry concealed weapons more in this northern model. Now, the southern concealed weapon bans and the Massachusetts model sort of converge in the early 20th century, and the model going forward sort of became the Sullivan Act of 1911. Required a permit to possess a handgun and to carry a concealable weapon in public. And the operative, the most important language in my view was that in order to receive a permit, the applicant had to establish a good reason for having the permit and also establish that they were of good moral character. And you can really sense the subjectivity in that kind of language, right? What might be considered a good reason to one person may not be considered a good reason to the issuing authority. What is good moral character in one person's view may not be good moral character in another person's view. So, you can see this language. This is from the California Penal Code. The very similar language applies if a person is applying for a concealed carry permit. The sheriff of a county may issue a license to that person upon proof of all of the following, and the first two being the most significant. The applicant is of good moral character and good cause exists for issuance of the license. So these are the twin towers of may issue discretion. Now, the may issue era, the restricted era of gun carry, has given way to first the shall issue concealed carry revolution, and subsequently the permitless carry era. And this graphic that I pulled from Wikipedia is amazing in just watching over the years from the 1980s to the present, how this blue wave sweeps across the country. And once the country is saturated with blue, then a green wave sets in. And you find, again, no red and very little yellow in the tail end of that graphic. So I'll just let that run through once again, because again, it's pretty dramatic in showing year over year how the shall issue revolution kicks in, and then the permitless revolution follows shortly after that. 2007, a lot of action in the permitless era after 2015. 4 states prior to 2015, and now 29 states. It's fairly remarkable. All right, there's 2024. So, this is just a list of when states became shall issue. I'm really curious about Washington State. It was so far ahead of every other state. You can see 1961, and we really think of sort of Washington today as being kind of, Starbucks and REI and Microsoft liberals, but it, has a very strong libertarian streak to it. And I wish, I'm not going to do it because I'm not a historian and I don't have time. But I think it would be really interesting for someone to figure out why is it that Washington State went shall issue when they did. People typically look at Florida as being the tipping point, although there were some other states, that got in before Florida, and, including Indiana. Florida, I think, clearly was a tipping point, but it was reflective of a movement that was percolating before they passed their law. But as soon as, Florida passed their law, year over year, more and more states went shall issue, and then the final holdouts went shall issue in 2013. And not surprisingly, 2 years after those states went shall issue, we see year over year more and more states becoming permitless, right? So Vermont has never required a permit to carry in public. Alaska was very early in terms of establishing a model where you didn't have to have a permit to carry, but you could get a permit to carry if you wanted to. This helped for various reasons, including having reciprocity in other states. I think my friend Matthew Carberry from Alaska calls this form of permitless carry Alaska carry, and I think he has a good point insofar as these are most of these permitless carry states. I think all of these permitless carry states, I should say, continue to issue permits to those who want them, either by incentivizing them. People can carry in more places and also for purposes of reciprocity. So that Alaska model, it's really more of an Alaska model than a Vermont model because Vermont has never even issued permits. So the overall distribution of carry laws right now is 29 unrestricted or permitless carry states, 13 states plus DC being shall issue states, and then I say 8 may issue states. The chat may be blowing up with people just going, Bruin, Bruin, Bruin. Yeah, so, the Bruin decision is likely to force these 8 remaining may issue states to become more shall issue. But as we'll see, there are different levels of permissiveness even within shall issue. But again, just to review how we got to the Bruin decision, DC versus Heller recognized the individual right to keep and bear arms for self-defense in the home. For the first time, established that as a constitutionally protected right. This was in the McDonald versus Chicago 2 years later. The court found the right established in Heller is incorporated by the 14th Amendment and therefore applies to every state. And then there was a period of quiet, and then the Bruin decision comes down that holds the right to keep and bear arms for self-defense that's established in Heller and McDonald applies not only in the home, but in public as well, right? So New York State Rifle and Pistol Association challenged Bruin, was like the chief law enforcement officer of the state or something like that. So that's why he's the defendant, but it's essentially challenging a New York State Sullivan Act, which I have mentioned previously, and maintaining that the good cause requirement was too strict, striking down the good cause requirement and therefore making it more of a shall issue jurisdiction. But not all shall issue laws are created equally. Even in shall issue states, the ability to receive a permit and the conditions under which permit holders can carry vary greatly. So immediately following the Bruin decision, New York State passed what was called the Concealed Carry Improvement Act, which retains the good moral character requirement, right? The court decision addressed the issue of good cause, but the good moral character requirement still stands. So now New York State requires 4 character references, 3 years of information about your social media accounts, in-person interview, and more. So across all states, you can ask certain questions. I won't ask and answer these questions, but I'll just raise the questions. How much does the permit cost? Even in New York State, this varies by jurisdiction from $10 to $100, say. You may have to pay the cost of fingerprints. I know in New York City, it's several $100s to get a concealed carry permit. Is training required, and how much training is required? The Concealed Carry Improvement Act said 16 hours of classroom work and 2 hours of live fire are required as a prerequisite for applying for a concealed carry permit. What weapons does the permit cover? What locations are excluded? Okay, this was a huge part of New York State's response to the Bruin decision, is to define sensitive places so broadly that you could effectively not carry anywhere. And it's not just New York State that's like this. If you have a good friend who lives in the city of Chicago, many friends in the city of Chicago, and if you start excluding all of the places where you can't legally carry, it becomes effectively impossible to be in downtown Chicago and to legally carry because of the sensitive places. So this is something that New York State's trying to take advantage of in this chess game of back and forth with the Bruin decision. And do other states recognize your state's permit? Which states honor? New York State doesn't honor any other state permits. I think something like 23 states honor New York State's permits, but it's certainly having a concealed carry permit in your home state is not like having a driver's license or a marriage license. It's not necessarily recognized in all 50 states. So this creates some challenges and a kind of patchwork quilt of laws if you travel around the country, as many people do. All right, so who carries? Not surprisingly, as concealed carry laws have liberalized, more and more people have concealed carry permits. So these are from the concealed carry permit holders across the United States 2023. You can Google it. It's a paper on the SSRN that John Lott and his colleagues have put together. The best, concrete estimates that we have of the number of concealed carry permit holders. So 21.8 million people in 2023. He actually notes that this is a slight decrease from 2022, which was when it peaked. But this still constitutes over 8% of all US adults have a concealed carry permit, which is a fairly remarkable number. And if you take New York and California out of there, it's over 10% or right around 10%. So depending on, where you're at, obviously, again, the problem with averages, in certain areas that might be 70%, in other areas it might be 1%. But I like to go around, places thinking in North Carolina, something like maybe 12 or 13% of people in North Carolina have a permit. What percentage of people who are around me when I'm at a Starbucks or wherever I happen to be are actually carrying? Of course, having a permit and carrying your gun are two very different things. We'll talk about who carries in a bit. Highest rates: Alabama 28%, Indiana 23%, Colorado. Colorado kind of surprised me, but I guess outside of the Denver and Boulder areas, it's pretty rural type state, pretty Western mentality about things. But those are the three highest rates. And now, again, 44% of the country lives in permitless carry states. This was in 2022, according to Lott's study. So we might see permitting rates go down over time as more people realize that they can carry without a permit. Although, these could be offset by more people in highly populous states like California, New York, New Jersey, if those become more fully shall issue, more people may carry there. So these may offset each other. And then this just shows you the state distribution of concealed carry permits in the population, from less than 2% in those yellow states, really showing how may issue laws are really designed to keep people from getting permits, making it extremely hard for people to get permits, all the way up to above 15% in certain states. And then lots of the green and lighter colored blue spread around also. So 2 to 15% is the most commonly seen percentage. Now, last week we talked about gun culture 2.0 and the changing face of gun owners. That the idea that self-defense is a universal concern, that some people will respond to that concern by owning and carrying firearms for self-defense. And so seeing more African Americans and other racial minorities, seeing more women and other gender minorities uh, becoming involved in firearms. Most states don't make their permit issue information available. Texas does, and you can see over time, up to the point where Texas adopted permitless carry, the percentage of all permit holders who were Black increased over time in most years. There's some up and down, but the secular trend is in an upward direction. And then the same thing for women. There's some ups and downs, but the overall trend up to the point where Texas went permitless was an increase in the percentage of all concealed permit holders in Texas who are women, increasing year after year after year. Now, I put this slide in just because it relates to me personally. And, I have this quote that I often use in my intro Soc class, that men make their own history, but they do not make it just as they please. They do not make it under circumstances chosen by themselves, but under circumstances directly encountered, given, and transmitted from the past. So, I have my own unique individual story of how I became a gun owner, how I became a concealed weapon permit holder in the state of North Carolina. But also, if I look at the data on the percentage change in the number of permit holders issued by race by year in North Carolina before they shut off access to this data, you see the top line is blue. Those are Asians have the steepest climb in growing numbers having concealed weapons permits. I got my permit in 2011, right as that slope was increasing. So, I made my own history, but it was much easier to make in a culture and in a legal framework that made it much easier to make that decision. So this is, I think, fairly informative to me when I look at that figure, because my experience fits right in there. All right. So, that's about permit holders, right? Having a permit doesn't mean you carry your gun. Not having a permit doesn't mean you don't carry a gun, right? So I'm reminded of the legendary gun trainer Tom Givens when he was a police officer in Tennessee in the 1970s. He tells the story that he pulled someone over, he wouldn't ask them, "Do you have a gun in your car?" Right? He would say or ask, "Where is the gun in your car?" Right? The assumption being that if it's the 1970s and you're in Tennessee, you probably have a gun. So just let me know where it's at. And if you look at data, a lot of people didn't ask questions about carrying back in the 1970s because that wasn't sort of seen as the main reason that people owned guns. But someone was smart enough in 1978 to say, "Do you ever carry your handgun or pistol outside of the house with you for protection or not?" Right? So this would include for protection, but also maybe if you're transporting it to your friend's house or you're going to the range or whatever you're using for. But 29% of people, who owned handguns at the time said they carried it outside the home with them. Now, fast forward to 2017. Again, this is the Pew Research Center's study that I like to mention. Right now, we're looking at the percentage of respondents who said they carry a handgun or pistol outside of their home. So this is among handgun owners, right? 11% all of the time, 15% most of the time. So a quarter saying, all of the time or most of the time carrying their firearm outside of the home, and some of the time adds another 31%. So 57% of people in 2017 who owned a handgun carried it outside the home. And this is a little bit more current data, a survey of gun owners conducted in 2019, right? What percent have carried a loaded handgun in the past 30 days, broken down by different kind of states, but across all jurisdictions, 30% of gun owners said in 2019 that they had carried a loaded handgun in the past 30 days. And looking at the trend, these authors asked the same question in 2015. So in 2015, it amounted to about 3 million people. And in 2019, about 6 million people, right? So not as many people who are as have permits or are permitted in a permitless carry state to carry, but a lot of people are carrying handguns outside the home. So it raises the question of why. And, I think on the one hand, this might seem to be a fairly basic question, why carry for defense? But sociologists in particular have asked this question and tried to answer this question. Sort of most notably, in my view, Jennifer Carlson, who published one of the first books on concealed carry called Citizen Protectors, the Everyday Politics of Guns in an Age of Decline. And the part of her book that I liked the best was sort of towards the conclusion, where she said, guns solve problems for the people who bear them, right? So if you want to understand why people carry, you want to understand what problems are people trying to solve by carrying those guns, right? And, to those of you in the crowd who carry firearms, you're like, yeah, that makes sense. I carry a gun because it solves certain problems for me. Now, the problem is when we're talking about what problems are solved in terms of sociologists, they tend to see the problems being solved as ideological ones. So this here is a summary of Carlson's answer to her own question as to why, what problems are being solved. She says that gun carry allows men to engage in everyday political acts that reassert their masculinity and help them to reclaim a sense of dignity as upstanding citizens. Again, this is where the age of decline in her subtitle becomes very relevant, right? So her citizen protectors are really masculine protectors, right? They're reasserting their masculinity and their sense of dignity that comes out of being protectors, right? If you can't protect your family by earning a good income, and in those ways, you can then be a protector by carrying a firearm. And this is really based in the way that Carlson and most other sociologists define gun culture itself, right? So this is an example. Mark Joslin, I love his work. So this, in giving his definition here, I don't mean to cast aspersion on him. It's just a limited definition. But he says gun culture focuses attention on the distinctive meanings that some people attach to guns. For some, guns symbolize power and violence, while for others, guns signify protection and freedom, right? So here, again, the focus is really ideological. The focus is really on the meanings that people attach to guns, right? And I think that it's absolutely true that in part, this is what gun culture does, and that in part, we want to understand the ideological problems that are solved by gun carry or the meanings that people attach to them. But I think that it closes off another way of looking at guns and gun culture and gun carry, which is more sort of my approach to defining gun culture, which is building on the kind of original medieval Latin basis to cultivare, right? To tend to or cultivate. So when I approach gun culture, I try to understand how gun culture helps people understand the world by defining certain problems and prospects, and that it helps people to take care of things in the world by providing tools for action in relation to those problems and prospects, right? So culture, and this is not me saying this, this is another sociologist, but he says culture in this sense amounts to ways of taking care of things, right? So really much more of a practical focus, right? What problems are solved by carrying guns? I think of them more in terms of practical problems. Risk management, right? How do I reduce physical insecurity, right? This idea that it's better to have a gun and not need it than to need a gun and not have it, right? Pascal's wager applied to guns. And I deal with this extensively in chapter 6 of my book, Gun Curious, where I try to highlight, the fact that it's not just about, protecting our sexual identity or our gender identity or our racial identity, but it's really about solving problems. And again, to me, this is more encompassing, right? In the same way, we want to understand, why is it that more women are turning to firearms for self-defense, and racial minorities and gender and sexual minorities, people who are marginalized? Like, if you only understand gun ownership in terms of, the ideologies of hegemonic masculinity and racism and white supremacy, how do you explain these diverse people becoming gun owners, other than to say there's some sort of kind of cultural dupes to the NRA, which is selling, white Christian nationalism to everybody. And there are people who argue that. I just think it's wrong. So, different starting point, different definition leads to kind of different focus and different conclusions. So when I look at why people carry, I'm much more looking at what gun culture does to allow people to take care of the things that they want to take care of. So, for example, in looking at the issue of how do you carry firearms, right? This is something that most sociologists, because they think of gun carry as primarily being ideological, they don't really even get into practical questions of how to carry a firearm, because at the same time that gun carrying solves certain practical problems for people, it also creates new practical problems that the gun carrier has to solve, right? And if we look at CCW, right, carry concealed weapon, right, the gun carrier has to solve the problem of, how do I even carry a firearm in public, right? How do I keep that firearm concealed, but also accessible, right? And what sort of firearm do I carry? So every one of those is not necessarily an assertion of carrying a concealed weapon. It's also raising problems that people are trying to address, and which gun culture tries to address, both in terms of hardware solutions and also software solutions. A lot of what I'm talking about here, I published in book chapter, which I was always very proud of, because I got to use the title, "The First Rule of Gunfighting is Have a Gun," something that I learned a lot in my early gun training courses that I observed. But, technologies of concealed carry, right? What is it that the culture provides materially in response to the problems that people face when they're trying to practically carry firearms in their everyday life, right? So you see some of these oppositions that are encountered, right? That if you're trying to carry a firearm concealed, right, the size and the weight of that firearm matter. But if you are thinking about the weapon, right, that you may be interested in the lethality in terms of stopping power and accuracy, right, and that may be opposed to size and weight, right? So something that's extremely small and concealable, right, may sacrifice some on the lethality side as compared to, the man stopping 45 ACP 1911, which just basically you hold it up and the people that you're confronting fly into a wall, but all very hard to carry in practical terms, although some people do it. So again, I see when I look at these technologies like holsters that people are practically trying to answer certain challenges that come out of the practice of concealed carry, right? Like, how do I keep it concealed? How do I keep it accessible? How can I wear it comfortably? And those things don't always fit together well, but this is kind of a holy grail, right? How can I design a holster that is going to allow someone to carry concealed accessibly and comfortably all at the same time? And you see all sorts of holster technologies, and these are in no way sort of endorsements of these products, but these are all products that I've photographed at gun shows, especially gun shows that focus particularly on concealed carry, right? So, you can have a pair of underwear that you wear, special compartment, you can wear the old concealment fanny pack. This marathon pack was one of the earlier ones I saw, but I still see many other companies putting out fanny pack style holsters. Your ankle holsters, your codpiece holster, your stealth operator holster, millions of variations on those kind of molded Kydex holsters. Um, and this, also raises particular challenges for women, right? And I always remember Kathy Jackson, the retired cornered cat gun trainer, is living her best life somewhere out in the Caribbean. But she wrote in this book that as many women have discovered, the curvier you are, the more painful it can be to hold an unyielding chunk of metal firmly against your waistline, right? So this raises a whole nother set of technical challenges for people, leads to a lot of off-body carry options for women, purse carry, how to create a purse that is also secure, as we know some tragic incidents of children getting into their mother's purses and shooting themselves or somebody else. Lots of examples of on-body carry specifically designed for women, especially, corsets. And then I would be remiss if I didn't mention the phenomenon of the Filster Enigma, which isn't a holster or a belt or a belly band or any other device you've encountered, right? So, this is a great example of someone, a couple of people, John Hauptman and his wife, Sarah, who, John for a long time has been trying to address the issue of how do you, carry concealed and comfortably and accessibly, and really thinking about, the holsters for a long time, even before the Enigma, as basically a prosthetic that you get a basic uh, tool, but then it has to be formed to your particular body and your particular needs. And, when he came out with the Enigma, I realized that this was him driving toward a solution to this problem that a lot of people have encountered. And, based on what I see, I don't have his sales data, but he seems to be selling quite a few of these. But again, it's no different. I mean, it's different sort of in the design. It's no different in being part of the material culture of guns, which seeks to solve a problem that people have when they choose to carry as a way of solving their problems of insecurity. Again, hardware problems create software problems, right? So these technologies to address hardware issues around concealed carry, like what holster do I use, what gun do I use, right, creates these software problems, right? How and when do you use the hardware? And here's where I think the gun training industry comes in. Again, something that I've been looking at for a number of years, what I call the software of gun culture 2.0. And the first, I think, starting point whenever we talk about training, and I put training in quotations here, has to do with concealed carry training requirements or concealed carry course requirements, or as concerns the trace, whether people who receive permits have to engage in any live fire training. And as you can see, this was actually published in 2023. They distinguish between states in purple that were permitless, so obviously no live fire training required there, right? Places where a permit was required to carry and also had a live fire training requirement. That was the brown. And then white is you have a permit required, but no live fire training. I had to go in and cross off Nebraska, Louisiana, and South Carolina because in the time from 2023 to now, those three states have also gone permitless. So those are three more states. So really only 14 of the 50 states require live fire training to carry a concealed gun. Now, those of you who are involved in serious gun training will, be already saying probably in the chat right now that your concealed carry class is not gun training. Demonstrating that you can fire a gun on a target is not a reflection of training. and it really is designed sort of to create a barrier to admission to be able to carry a firearm, which is, I think a very awkward thing for many people, especially in the gun training industry, to say, because they believe very much in voluntary gun training. They just don't believe in state required training. But again, empirical studies of gun training, very few and far between, for as much as people who want greater regulation of firearms in the United States, including public health scholars, talk about, people need more training. There should be training requirements to have guns. And very few people have set about to study what gun training looks like. But there is a 2015 National Firearms Survey from Harvard and Northeastern, again, one of my go-to sources of data, asked respondents, have you ever had any formal firearms training? And overall, about 60% of gun owners say that they've had some formal firearms training, right? What exactly that training is, they don't say, but that gives us some sort of baseline. We can get an idea of what kind of training people are getting if we look at certain things. So I first, want to point out my kind of defensive gun owners. If you own one handgun, okay, so here about 53% of those folks have had some formal firearms training, so less than gun owners overall, right? If your reason for owning a handgun is only for protection, 57%, again, lower than the average gun owner. But if you look at people who have concealed carry permits, right, so 83% of people who have concealed carry permits say that they've had some formal firearms training, sort of, which leads me to believe that a lot of people in their minds, when someone asks them if they've had formal firearms training, they think, yes, I had a concealed carry class, again, which most gun trainers would not consider firearms training. So we have this issue here. And again, have you carried a loaded handgun in the past 30 days? 83% of those who said they had formal firearms training. But again, are we just talking about their concealed carry class, which could potentially be problematic? Now, the other side of the coin is that we don't have a situation where people don't have formal firearms training and carry their weapons in public and just go around shooting people, right? If we saw that, right, that, we would, perhaps think that training is more necessary. But the examples that we have of people accidentally shooting themselves or other people, or maliciously shooting themselves, are sort of mercifully small when we're talking about people who are legally carrying concealed weapons in public. Although there are problematic examples of that. Again, what do we know about firearms instructors today? Almost nothing, right? We know that there are 100 and however many NRA certified instructors, and that 15 to 20% of those are certified to teach personal protection courses. So some 28,000 people able to do this. I sometimes look at this LinkedIn group called Firearms Instructors. It's got over 10,000 people in it. There's a American Professional Firearms Instructors Association Facebook group, a couple thousand people in it. But really the firearms training industry is completely self-regulated, right? But it's self-regulated in a very sort of diffuse way, right? Or a very laissez-faire way. There's no central certifying, credentialing, or licensing body. So I would say that firearms training is what we would call pre-professional, right? Professions create their own standards, right? They create their own rules of ethics, and they apply those standards and ethics to everyone who considers themselves a member. And there have been attempts to create these sorts of professional associations of gun trainers. They just haven't really gotten off the ground. And lots of, again, gun trainers that I've spoken to over the decade or more that I've been wandering around the gun training community, right, express concern that pretty much anybody can call themselves a gun trainer, right, and say, I are a firearms trainer, right? I won't say who used that quote, but I think that reflects the way a lot of people look at this very diffuse process. Now, There is some branding, right? That people can get certified to buy certain gun trainers. This weekend, some people in the audience here know the formerly called the Polite Society Tactical Conference was held in Dallas. Tom Gibbons, Rangemaster, puts it on, brings together lots of top trainers. People take those courses. You can be certified by Rangemaster as an instructor and a master instructor. John Korea's Active Self-Protection has a firearms trainer certification. Lots of people are kind of going in that direction as a way of saying, hey, I certify this person as a gun trainer, right? But those are things that are being done by individual firearms trainer, not by the firearms training community per se. So it raises the question, like in gun training, what is actually taught? And I'm getting towards the end here and getting towards my typical hour. Again, we don't really know very much. I do spend a chapter in my book, Gun Curious, talking about my experience of the gun training community. And if I have enough interest in continuing working in this area on a book about gun culture 2.0 more broadly than my own sort of experience, then I'll definitely want to talk more about gun training, the sort of problems, challenges, and the prospects of the gun training community. But there are two studies I know of that look at what's actually taught in firearms classes. One is a more quantitative study based on a public health audit of firearms classes, and one that's more qualitative ethnographic study looking at a limited number of cases, but in a more in-depth way. So this public health audit led by David Yamane, who's one of the sort of leading public health scholars out of Harvard, who's been looking at firearms for years. They audited 20 basic firearms classes in 7 northeastern states. So they sent people in, they created an audit form with the advice of expert instructors. I don't know who they were, maybe Mike the gun guy. But they went into these 20 classes and they had the auditors indicate what was being taught, right? And so, they looked at from all the classes covered certain things to very few. All the trainers covered a wide variety of safety issues, right? 90 plus percent of the classes, how to safely load and unload a gun, keep your finger off the trigger until ready to shoot, be aware of your target and what's behind it, right? So basic loading and unloading, and then the 4 rules of gun safety. 1/2 to 75% of classes, the trainer covered topics such as operating a safety, clearing jams, cartridge malfunctions, and recommended storing guns unloaded and locked when not in use. So this is, fairly common topic. But then few instructors covered firearms suicide prevention or domestic violence. Most encourage gun ownership, gun carrying, gun use, and self-defense, not surprisingly, perhaps. I know that Michael Sodini and Walk the Talk America are working up materials to make it easier for people who teach basic firearms classes to include the issue of suicide prevention. So hopefully if, this study was redone again today or in 5 years or 10 years, we'd see those numbers coming up. But, this gives some sense of what is and isn't being taught in a basic firearms class. And then last, right on time, Harel Shapira, sociologist at the University of Texas. Some of you will be familiar with his name for reasons I'll be mentioning on my last slide. Published an article with one of his students called Learning to Need a Gun. So participant observation in firearms training classes and interviews with 46 gun carriers. And his central argument is that the practice of carrying guns is constituted by both cognitive schemas about risk and safety, as well as sensory and embodied experiences of comfort and even pleasure in holding, shooting, and carrying a gun, right? So he's basically trying to understand how is it that people learn how to need a gun, right? That needing a gun is not self-evident or something that people come upon themselves. So He specifically looks at three cognitive schemas that are taught in gun training classes, right? So learning to think you need a gun because the world is a dangerous place, right? Even if it's a low odds problem, it's high stakes. So again, he doesn't assume that people who take firearms classes already think that they need a gun because the world is a dangerous place. They're taught to uh, think that they need a gun. Learning to think that guns are safe by redefining them as tools and therefore normalizing them as innocuous objects. I certainly, hear this quite a lot. I've, mentioned my own perspective on this, that I think that, yes, guns are tools, but they're not just like any other tool. But, I see, this also in the training classes that I've looked at, right? Getting people to think of guns as being normal things that normal people use. And then his third cognitive schema is learning to think of killing another human being as a moral action by creating a binary between good guys and bad guys, right? So, if you're confronting a bad guy, it is a moral action to kill that person. And again, I wouldn't disagree with that. I might nuance it in certain other ways. But I think the fundamental idea there is something I've also seen. So then he argues that training helps to take those cognitive schemas that are taught in the classes and turn them into embodied experiences of comfort holding and carrying a gun, right? So you can use this gun, you can carry this gun, right? Because the world is dangerous, that the gun is a tool for addressing that, and that it's morally okay to use the gun to defend yourself against a bad guy. And, I think that, if he only went that far, that I don't know that I would fundamentally disagree with him in terms of his observation of what he's seeing taught in the classes and how training affects people in terms of understanding gun ownership. The problem is where he eventually is going to take this is that he's under contract to publish a book based on this research, and he previewed what the book was going to be about last summer in an essay in the New York Times called "Firearms Classes Taught Me and America a Very Dangerous Lesson," right? And some of the lessons that he was taught are the things that he talks about in this earlier paper, like thinking that shooting another human being is a moral action, right? And thinking that the world is a dangerous place so that you overreact to certain situations. And, I'm patiently waiting for the book to come out to see, how he develops this. But in the meantime, I have posted on my blog a response to this essay called "Firearms Classes Taught Me Very Different Lessons Than Harel Shapira." And I also directly address Shapira and other people's arguments about gun training in chapter 8 of my book, Gun Curious, which is called "Being Responsibly Armed." So, I think, again, one of the sort of bottom line points that I would make out of all of this is that we really know very little about gun culture 2.0 in terms of what people are actually doing and thinking, because the way the questions have been set up by scholars have been so particular. They're looking at gun ownership and gun carry in very particular ways that limits what they're able to see, right? Every way of seeing is a way of not seeing. So I'm, in my work, try to complement or take up those areas of scholarship that people look at less. But this also previews what we'll talk about next week in Module 4, which is defensive gun use and why scholars have a problem with it, for lack of a better way of phrasing that. Okay, it is once again 7 o'clock. I don't even know how I end up creating 1 hour's worth of material, but that's just how it goes. So let me unshare and see what sort of questions we have here. If you want to get a question in, go ahead. I got 6 questions. I'll answer them in order, and I'll stay on until the questions dry up. Okay. How does your historical timeline and restrictions for carry compare to the Supreme Court's discussion of state regulations in New York State Rifle Pistol Association versus Bruin? Um, I I didn't read the Bruin decision. I just read the synopsis of it, so I don't know where it's similar or different. But I haven't. I've shared my timeline at, for example, a meeting of people from the Duke Firearms Law Center and the University of Wyoming's Firearms Research Center, so firearms attorneys, and no one has challenged my basic description of that timeline. And I know that I've added the material on the Massachusetts model, which wasn't part of the work that I published in this early book, which came out before Bruin. Um, but as far as I know, the timeline isn't controversial. There is a lot of question about, what sorts of restrictions on public carry existed at the time of the founding, right? So I mentioned this Statute of Northampton that, really informs English common law relative to carry. And, people who are pro-Bruin and who are anti-Bruin disagree very profoundly on the meaning of that. So, certainly it is the case that understanding the history, text, and tradition of gun laws has become more important with Bruin. Arguably, the more important part of Bruin is not the fact that it struck down the good cause requirements in New York, although that was important, but it was more arguing that going forward, history, text, and tradition would be the standard by which contemporary gun regulations would be judged. And this has just thrown, incredible chaos into the courts and scholars trying to understand what regulations were in the past, how those might be analogous to contemporary regulations. So it's an extraordinarily dynamic period right now. Sean Sorrentino, were Southern concealed carry bans ever enforced on white residents? I don't know the immediate or sort of concrete answer to that, but I would suspect that they were, because the concealed carry bans, according to Clayton Kramer at least, really explainable when dueling was banned. It took away one of the main ways that people could civilly settle personal disputes. And it kind of just threw things into the chaos of settling disputes person to person. And a lot of those people who were settling those disputes person to person were white Southerners, right? So I, would assume that to the extent that the bans were enforced, they were enforced on the white residents. Jane, from mentioning of which states or territories cited as starting to clamp down on concealable weapons, I'm wondering if there were specific contentious issues and populations behind the semi-barbarous state being cited by de Tocqueville. Yeah, I think, similar to what, Sean said, I don't know that this particular set of regulations was really meant to tamp down on certain marginalized populations like African Americans, because they were, largely populations who were disarmed anyway. So it was really, I think a problem more of, white Southern men, fighting with each other to settle personal disputes, as we, see a lot of gun violence as being related to personal disputes even today. John Nystrom, although scholars and historians have discussed Southern culture of violence as the predicate of those laws against concealed carry in the cultural South, yes, Indiana in that era was settled primarily from the Ohio River into Southern Indiana. How much of that may have been an artifact of slavery culture? I can't directly answer that question. I tread, very lightly into the world of history. A lot of this history hasn't been very well covered. But again, I think that a lot of explanations are taken up and dismissed by Clayton Kramer in his study of these early adopting states. And he does sort of see it as in some way related to honor culture, I think, and the culture of violence in the South. But at the same time, we see in this Massachusetts model coming, in 1836, this is fairly contemporaneous. So the idea of people carrying concealed weapons was something that was a concern, not just in the South, although the Southern states were early adopters. Jane, addendum. If it seemed that people were too often willing to escalate to shooting over disputes, I think of the bitter existential politics over issues like slavery or other areas where people rapidly justify being okay to shoot other folks. Yeah, again, we don't know all of the reasons why people took to not just shooting each other, but stabbing each other. These early concealed carry laws targeted all sorts of weapons, and not necessarily primarily guns. The Arkansas toothpick is regularly referred to. So people stabbing each other in these personal disputes. But I think that human beings have the capacity to get in arguments with each other over all sorts of things. I was reading in this other book recently about gun culture, starts with the case of the guns and ammo editor who got in a dispute with his neighbor and ended up shooting his neighbor. This is some of these things are just because we're human. Joe Wade, I have yet to see someone give a clear answer to this, but you might know. Why is it that carry permits are not covered under the full faith and credit in Article 4 of Section 1? I don't actually know the answer to that, but I'm going to try to copy and paste that question somewhere. Where am I going to paste it to? I don't know. Maybe I'll take a photo of that question. I think I know someone who might be able to answer that question. So snap a photo of that, and I'll try to answer it either next week or in some way. So thanks for raising the question. Teaching self-defense law is an important part of concealed carry training. This discusses the core of the moral issue that must be confronted to stop an immediate lethal or sexual attack threat. Why is this such a political and cultural issue? For me, one of the most valuable things about taking a concealed carry course, and I, fortunately can afford the time and money it takes to take concealed carry courses, and I think everybody who can afford the time and money should do it, is understanding the law, right? And I think that there are people who don't really understand the law of self-defense, people who don't understand what stand your ground means or what castle doctrine is, including people who are critical of guns for self-defense. And so every time, someone shoots somebody, they say, oh, that's because of stand your ground laws. So, I have been fortunate, and this is not really answering your question. This is just me talking about my own experience. But, I was very fortunate in my own experience to probably the first serious, gun training course I ever took was Masad Ayub's Mag 40 course. And he talks at length about the ethical and the moral issues involved in using lethal force in self-defense. So I think it's a hugely important part of concealed carry courses. It's an important part of any kind of defensive pistol or defensive firearms course. And I think it's, one reason it's such a touchy political issue from the other side, and this is something I talk about in the conclusion of my book, is that a lot of people, who are opposed to guns aren't really opposed to guns per se, because, they don't mind if people have, shotguns for sporting clays, or they do long range precision rifle or those kind of things. They specifically don't like guns for self-defense because they don't like the idea that people would use lethal force to defend themselves, right? They're just uncomfortable with the idea of lethal violence. And so, I think that's where, Shapira, again, where he characterizes this distinction between good guys and bad guys as creating a moral authorization to use lethal force from the perspective of someone who's comfortable with the morality of that. He's just making an objective statement, but in his view, it's more of a criticism. So that was sort of long-winded. I think it's a really great question that you've asked, though. Will one of these sessions cover how the proper legal, ethical, moral use of firearms and how that is perceived versus established common law standards? Yeah, I mean, we are moving on really from this issue, and I think in part, as an empirical social scientist, the question of the proper use of firearms falls a bit beyond my own, level of expertise. I'm not a constitutional scholar. I'm not a firearms trainer. Right? I am a normal sort of functioning gun owner, but what I want to talk about here is what I know about how the world works with respect to that. So, the perception of proper use compared to established common law standards, that may be a legal issue. I think if you went around and asked people what are the established common law standards for use of lethal force in self-defense, and most people have no idea. So, it really falls outside of my bailiwick, I would say. But I will say also, I am going to put an excerpt of today's session on YouTube. And if you want to sort of give your own views of that and try to spark a discussion of that in the comments over there, I'd be really interested to see what other people think about that. Will Sakrapanti? It's got the last two questions, and then I think we'll wrap up. So, is there any data breaking down firearms training by type? For instance, gun safety versus defensive handgun versus competition? Absolutely not. Right. So, the data that I know of is sort of the data that I showed, and it really, kind of asks people if they've ever had firearms training, and doesn't really say what sort of training people have had. It would be great if we knew more about, the types of firearms training that people are getting. If someone, has a spare 50 or $100,000 laying around, I'm sure I could get that kind of survey off the ground. But again, a lot of the limitations we have with respect to data on what lawful gun owners do legally with their firearms sort of falls outside of the dominant frameworks that scholars have taken to guns, which is to try to understand the negative outcomes with firearms. And there are some exceptions, but really it's hard to come across any kind of fine-grained data on this. And as one person, trying to understand these other aspects of guns and gun culture, the normality of guns and gun culture, it's just there's only so much I can do. And final question. This is my last question. I meant prevalence or popularity of different types of training. No, I got it, and it's a great question. And, as I tried to say that, there really is a limited amount that we know about who does firearms training. What are their credentials for doing firearms training? What kinds of classes do they teach? And then on the other side, what kind of classes do people take? What are they learning? What's the substance? There's just vast areas of something that I think is really important that, have gone unstudied. On the other hand, there's a lot of gun trainers, who will openly complain about how there's a lot of gun owners who are just not interested in serious gun training, right? They would rather buy another rifle or another pistol or spend money pretty much on anything else other than taking a gun training class. So, when we again see that 64% of people say they've taken a formal firearms class, right? If you take hunter education and concealed carry classes out of that, what else have people taken, right? So here, this is Carl Wren talks about the 1%, right? The 1% of people who take serious firearms training beyond some very basic introductory level course. So, maybe there's not any sense in doing more research quantitatively, like fielding a survey to ask people what different kinds of courses they've taken, because if you ask 2,000 gun owners and 1% of those, or 1% of 2,000 is what? 200? No, that's 10%. 20? What it doesn't get you very far. But I would love to see more work in that area. Okay, chat is amazing. So many people still hanging in there. Thank you all so much for being here. Have a great week, everybody, and I'll see some of you next week.